more purpose, and lead an overcoming life. Have you ever wondered what really attracts the attention of God Almighty? Have you desired to be able to walk fully in your calling and be able to cooperate with the God of the universe to really advance his kingdom? Do you desire to have an intimate relationship with God that you can hear his voice and be prompted to do bold things, to take risk for the sake of God? Well, you're going to enjoy this contrast today with Jonathan and his father, King Saul. And we're looking at 1 Samuel chapter 14. And at the beginning of the day, there was nothing about the day to indicate it would be one of great victory and be remarkable. But it was on this day that God would win a great victory through the bold trust of Jonathan. Now, here's the contrast. Saul was sitting and he was under a tree. And this is a big contrast to Jonathan, who's ready to act. He's simply, as the king, sitting under the pomegranate while the Philistine garrison is building and ready to annihilate them. But Jonathan says to his armor bearer, "Come on, let's cross over to this force of the Philistines, these uncircumcised, these idol worshipers. Maybe the eternal one will fight for us. And if he wants to save us, then no force is too big or too small." Now do whatever you think is right, the armor bearer says to him. "I will follow you, and my decision will be your decision." You know, armor bearers in ancient times were one of the most trusted confidants, and they needed to be unusually brave and loyal because the lives of their masters often depended upon him. Now, while all this is happening, the people didn't know that Jonathan was gone. This indicates that Jonathan did not go over to the Philistines in order to attract personal attention. He wasn't trying to get personal glory. If that were his motive, he would have told at least a few people, "Hey, I'm going over there to save the day." But that wasn't Jonathan. Jonathan knew the need was great. Israel was hopelessly outnumbered and they were demoralized. Jonathan knew that God wanted to use someone, and King Saul just wanted to sit under a pomegranate tree. Something had to be done, and Jonathan was willing to take action and let God use him. And Jonathan knew God wanted to work with someone. He knew the character of God. And Jonathan could have just prayed that God would rain down fire from heaven on the Philistines. But Jonathan knew that God uses bold action. God uses a fighting spirit of his people. And it was not Jonathan that was to work with some help from God. It was the Lord that was to work by Jonathan. Jonathan had the right attitude. And Jonathan had never read the New Testament. It wasn't in existence yet. But think about Romans 8:31. If God be for us, who can be against us? Jonathan had that attitude. And his faith was not in himself. He had great faith in God. I can win this great victory with God. It's his focus was God winning the victory even through him. So Jonathan says, "Now we will approach the Philistines and let them see us. If they say, 'Wait there, we are coming to you,' then we will stay where we are and we will not advance. But If they say, come here, then we will go to them. And that will be a sign that the eternal one has given us power over them. So Jonathan's deciding on a sign, and it's a miraculous attitude. So they let the Philistines see them. They're not even surprising them. And the Philistine soldiers ridiculed them. And the soldiers said, look, there are some of the Hebrews climbing out of the holes where they've been hiding. And they signaled to Jonathan and his armor bearer. And the soldiers said what Jonathan had said, this is going to be the sign. They said, come here, you two, come here, and we will show you something. The Philistines believe that no one can climb up to them. And Jonathan says to the armor bearer, follow me. The eternal one has assured victory for Israel. And Jonathan is scrambling up this steep incline on his hands and his knees and his feet to the Philistine soldiers. And his armor bearer was right behind. And when he appeared before the Philistines, they fell before him, and he and his armor bearer killed them right and left. And in this first assault, Jonathan and his armor bearer killed about 20 men within an area of about a half an acre. And when the news of this slaughter spread, it caused this great trembling in the Philistine camp. So God's moving through the camp. The soldiers are fleeing in the field. And even there was a shaking among the whole nation. Their garrison of troops were so confused and afraid. And the raiding parties who had terrorized Israel trembled. And soon the earth itself quaked, and an awesome trembling abounded. I love how God does this miracle using the action of Jonathan. And it didn't matter if the Philistines greatly outnumbered the Israelites and they had a far better weapons. God was more than able to set the Philistines against each other. And if the Israelites had no swords, the Lord would use the swords of the Philistines against the Philistines. God was fighting on their behalf. This is a miracle. And then the earth quaked. So it was a very great trembling. And you think about how Jonathan was using his heart and his sword, but it wasn't himself. It was God fighting for him. And he set the earthquake to frighten the Philistines. God often does miracles, and he could do it all alone, but he likes to work with you and me. And so here's Jonathan and his armor bearer winning the day. And from a distance, Saul's watchmen at Gibeah, they can kind of see that the Philistines are melting away. They have no idea why. And the Philistines are rushing back and forth. And Saul says, call the roll. I want to know who is missing from our camp. And after the roll call, they realized that Jonathan and his armor bearer were gone. And then Saul acts in this foolish way. He's just trying to prove himself. He cares about appearances. And so he calls down this curse and he says, curse on anyone who stops to eat before evening comes, and I have my revenge on my enemies. I mean, he's just making this boastful curse. So none of the army ate anything. And all they passed through the forest by honeycomb with honey on the ground. The people just like passed right over, and the honey was dripping out, but none of them dared to reach out for a taste because they were afraid of Saul's curse. And think about the honey, it would have strengthened them. But Jonathan hadn't heard Saul's words. So when he passed the honeycomb, he reached out his staff that he was carrying and took some honey, put it in his mouth, and he was immediately refreshed. And so this foolishness of Saul, he's not even caring for the armies. It takes a lot of energy to fight, and they needed food. And if you think about this honey on the ground, it was provision from God. And the Israel army, they were hot in the pursuit of the Philistines. They were all tired. They were hungry. They needed this energy to continue the pursuit, to finish the battle. And God had provided honey on the ground. But I want you to see Saul's character here. He doesn't care about the men, he just cares about his own appearances. Well, a soldier says to Jonathan, "Your father strictly charged us not to eat anything. He said he would be cursed if we did. That's why we are so weak with hunger." And Jonathan replies, "Then my father has troubled our people for no reason. See how much stronger I am after tasting the honey?" Wouldn't it have been better if our soldiers had been free to eat some of the food they had taken from the enemy? Our slaughter of the Philistine is not as great as it could be because we are too weak to pursue it. Now, Jonathan here is just plain being practical. But Saul says to Jonathan, "What have you done?" Jonathan says, "I certainly tasted a little honey with the tip of the staff I carried, and I'm ready to die." I mean, here's Jonathan willing to die even for the foolishness of Saul. And then Saul says, "May the true God do the same and more to me, my son Jonathan. You must die." So he made this rash curse and he's going to follow through on it. But it's the people that step in and they protect Jonathan. And the people say, "Would you execute Jonathan, the one who won Israel's great victory?" Of course not. As the Eternal One lives, not a hair of his head should be harmed because he worked with the true God today to give us victory. So the people were the ones that ransomed Jonathan, and he was not killed. And so Saul now feels humiliated. And he just stops pursuing the Philistines, and the Philistines who were left return to their own land. So you have a king pouting about being humiliated. He could only think of himself. Now, let's contrast Saul's character to his son Jonathan. Saul was completely self absorbed, he was self centered. Saul was selfish. But Jonathan was God centered. Jonathan was selfless. Saul was the one that wanted others to fight his battle for him. You know, he was faithless. But Jonathan was bold and courageous warrior. He was faithful. Saul was willing to sacrifice every relationship to get ahead in appearance. But Jonathan was strengthened by the covenant relationship with David, who we're going to talk about tomorrow. And he was willing to sacrifice his own advancement. And he also remained loyal to his imperfect dad. Now, I hope that you received just some encouragement today like I did. I really love reading this story, and I read through the Bible every year. So when it comes up, I allow God to put a magnifying glass to my character. And it's easy for us to look at other people and think, "Oh, they're like Saul, their leadership, they're selfish." But really, allowing God to search your own heart. God, are there places where I've been self-absorbed, selfish, self-centered? God, help me to be God-centered. Lord, are there places in my life that I'm sitting back and letting others take bold risk? Or am I on the tip of my toes, ready to obey God, bold? Now, at the beginning, we talked about what attracts God's attention. I want you to realize it's what Jonathan did. It's his boldness, his courage. And it doesn't matter what our age is. It's not that if you're young in years, you're going to be bold and valiant. I would say to each one of us, the longer we walk with God, the more confident we should be in how He's a God of miracles. He's a God who defeats the enemy, and that we're willing to go anywhere He wants us to do anything He wants us to do. We're bold. And as we walk in that faith, then God shows up and He does the miracles. Well, thanks for joining me today on Healing Rain. And I pray that you would be encouraged to be bold and courageous, to move forward in faith. And I'd love to hear from you. You can find me on social media at Sue Detweiler, or go to my website, SueDetweiler.com, and you can download 5 Steps of Grace, a journey guide to freedom. I'm looking forward to hearing about your bold exploits of faith and how we can pray for you in your journey to walk in God's healing rain.